Hi everybody, I'm Nick Pidgeon. I'm Professor of Environmental Psychology at Risk at Cardiff University. I've been involved in this work on enhanced rock weathering and the Leverhulme Centre for the full 10 years since its inception. And I lead the Sustainability and Society theme within the Leverhulme Centre, and that involves a number of colleagues, including those who we will talk with today. The disciplines that we represent in this podcast broadly cover something called environmental psychology, so that's how we understand people think about the environment. Geography, which is basically how space and place is distributed and some of the ethical issues around that. And thirdly, science and technology studies, which is a brand of sociology, or a branch of sociology, I should say, which looks at how technologies come into being and the relationship between technology and society. And you might ask the question, and David Beerling, who leads the centre, was very foresighted in adding a social science, quite a large social science component into the work of the centre, alongside the natural science work, to really work in parallel with them. Why would you want social scientists involved in the first place? And it's because technologies do not arise in a societal vacuum. We've known that for many, many, many years. And think about it this way. New technologies or new agricultural developments, as in we're talking about here, are always designed and envisioned by scientists and entrepreneurs as well. So there have been people involved in the design of the technologies. Often they're very expert in their field. Then, if you move to deployment, there are institutions, organizations involved, again, with this carbon removal by enhanced weathering. You could think of basically the agricultural system, the agronomic system, which involves farmers, but it also involves people who might produce the material in the quarries and other parts of the supply chain. And of course, there are regulatory and market actors involved in this as well. And we need to understand the ways in which the way those different organizations and institutions work. And the ways in which they might either facilitate or inhibit the development of the technology. And then finally, a third reason why social science is important is because new technologies, if they become material reality, exist within cultures and they exist within communities. So somebody ultimately has to live with the deployment of the technology, whether it's seeing what the farmers are doing locally to a village or to a town, or actually being part of the farming community that might deploy that technology. So it's been known for many, many years, again, moving back, thinking about other new technology developments, that there are often societal and ethical issues that arise with new technologies. Known very well in the health community, I think, and so there have been councils on, for example, bioethics for many, many years, which looked at new health development, that looked at new health technology developments and asked the question, were there any ethical questions over that? So the idea of human cloning would be a really well-known example in that area where lots of ethical debates have occurred, and some people think it's a good idea and others people think, obviously, it should not happen at all. So that's one of the questions, I suppose, for us as social sciences. What are some of the ethical questions that arise with the whole idea of enhanced weathering and the ways in which it might be deployed for carbon removal? I'll give you an example. There are two ethical issues which have arisen and were kind of thought of even before our program started. The first one is, should we play God by trying to alter planetary climates at a global scale? And I think that's a fairly fundamental question. And the second one is something the so-called mitigation deterrence issue. Would the use of this technology and the use of large amounts of society's funds to deploy the technology, will it deflect from efforts to reduce emissions? And there's been a very big debate about that, not just in relation to weathering, but in relation to other carbon removal technologies. So we're also interested primarily in our research group in what we call public perceptions. That's how people think, feel, and respond to the technology when they have first learned about it through whatever means, through the media or through talking to somebody who knows about it or taking part in one of our studies. And there are three reasons why we might want to study public perceptions. The first one is that given likely low awareness, and Elspeth, my colleague, will talk about this shortly, how will communities and individuals respond to something that really they've never heard of before, and then they're suddenly told about it? What feelings and ideas will that bring to mind? And that has a very important implication, because it's only by doing that you're able to understand the best way to inform people about enhanced rock weathering or new carbon removal technologies. You've got to understand where they're coming from in the first place before you can design any communication to tell them about the technology. And that's a basic principle of what's called science communication, as it has developed over many, many years in the UK and other countries. The second reason is lay people are not technical experts, for sure, most of the time, but they do bring wider values to bear on the choices and the problems that scientists bring to fruition. And in the case, there's a good example in the case of enhanced weathering. I think that very early on in the programme, we knew, and our science colleagues knew, that there would be issues over biodiversity, that there should be measurements done in relation to the impacts upon the local environment when spreading basalt on fields. But that was something that has clearly come out of the work we've done with members of the public, that they would say straight away. They think about, here's a new material being spread in a local region that may be local to them or to some other community. Are you going to harm the local wildlife? Because people are concerned and clearly very protective of the local biodiversity in their area. And so that's kind of a local value that comes out through talking to people about their perceptions, which you might then use to help steer the science program, because you're kind of saying that you may have these science concerns about the technology or the issue, but ordinary people will also raise these other concerns which you might not have thought about. I mean, again, there's a history of research in this area where technologists, scientists will design a new device or a new component, and they've not thought of something that, and again, going back to the medical analogy, often you get patient groups which help with the design of new medical technologies, precisely because they know and they're closest to the conditions under which those technologies and devices would actually be used. So we're trying to think in those terms. What values will local people bring to bear on this new idea of enhanced rock weathering? And then finally, the third reason is because really there's a kind of a normative or an ethical reason for doing public perception, and in particular public engagement work, that it's worth doing in its own right in a democratic society. So people have a right to know about the new technologies that may affect their life or may affect the lives of people in their communities or their area or their country. And overall, the way we think about this within the discipline, in particular of science and technology studies, is the idea of responsible innovation, that you're taking social intelligence from lay experts, putting that with the science intelligence that's coming from the trials and all the laboratory work that goes on, to try and understand how a responsible pathway for developing the technology might be forged. As social scientists, and we'll hear a little bit more about this in this podcast, we collect data. We don't just sit in our laboratories or in our offices and kind of think up what people might think about this. So we've got a range of well-developed methods in the social sciences to collect data on public perceptions and to understand what happens when you engage people with new technologies. So in particular, we have specialized in interview-type analysis. And this would be with stakeholders, so people who have some kind of role within the organizations or institutions that might have an interest in the technology, whether it's farmers or it's regulators or it's people who might want to fund its deployment. We do surveys. So these are generally large samples. You're looking for a representative sample just to get a feeling, and I use the word superficial, but a surface feeling of how people respond to the issue, in this case, enhanced weathering, when that is presented to them. And surveys, I would add, are very valuable because they give you a sense in which for example, how many people are aware of the technology in the first place. They will tell you that 80%, 90% have never heard of it before. But they don't really give you much more below the surface, which is why then we use what are called deliberative or qualitative methods, which are small n type methods. But you are then, instead of asking somebody a few questions about it over a period of maybe 20 minutes, you are actually taking people through a process of learning about the technology, deliberating about the technology, thinking and talking to other people about what they think about these developments, and coming up with a more reasoned opinion and set of opinions about what some of the implications for them might be. So those three methods in the Leverhulme Centre, we've deployed all of those, and we see our overall task is to bring intelligence, information, data from all three of those together to paint a picture of how society might be responding to enhanced weathering as both a science idea and as a deployable technology. In Cardiff in particular, I think it'd be fair to say over the last few years, with a number of technologies in the past, genetic modification of food, we've done work on something called nanotechnologies. We've also done wider work on geoengineering, which is planetary cooling in particular, which actually is a rather very controversial technology. It raises a lot more ethical issues than carbon removal does. And what you find is if a technology has relatively low awareness in the public surveys, then you really do have to work quite hard to present information in a balanced way. It's very important not to overframe or overbias information, either in a pro-technology way or in an anti-technology way, or stressing one aspect of the problem at the expense of other aspects. So you're trying to present a range of views. And at the same time allowing people, participants particularly in the workshops that we run, to what is called open the conversation up, i.e. bring their ideas and frames of reference to bear upon the problem, to try and work out whether there are novel issues that they might wish to raise. And we also do local public engagements where one goes to local communities who might potentially host the technology. And that can be quite creative, because that will explore what enhanced rock weathering deployment will mean for them in their own area and their own lives. And I mentioned that we draw upon geographical research to understand that. And of course, geography is precisely about that. It's about place and identity and what matters to people in their local areas. So there are sort of two levels to the public perception research there. One is this general, how would people in general, who could be anywhere, in the city or in the country or somewhere else, how do they respond to the idea of the technology? And then how do people who might be affected locally in their area respond to it as well? We've also, as you will hear, had, because the centre is an international centre, the main field trial sites are international, in particular in the US and in Malaysia and in Australia and other countries around the globe. So we've concentrated a number of our efforts in collecting data in some of those countries, and that has its own challenges as well. So I think that's enough to introduce this, and I will now move on and introduce my colleague. So delighted to introduce Dr Elspeth Spence. She is an environmental psychologist. She's been working on our public perceptions data for about 8 years now. She's one of the core members of the Leverhulme team. And I'd like to just ask you a kind of a first question. Can you give us an idea of the types of things you've been doing? What data have you been collecting and analysing, Elspeth?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Nick, for inviting me to take part. There's quite a lot, actually. I mean, I think for our project, we started back when I was doing my PhD in 2016. We had a little add-on to think about initial thoughts on enhanced rock weathering before we went into the full Leverhulme project. So we kind of superseded Leverhulme by the first data we looked at to get those initial ideas about what people were thinking about enhanced weathering. But as you've already covered, we've done quite a lot of different types of methods. So we've had surveys, we've conducted stakeholder interviews along with my colleague, Dr Emily Cox, who's no longer part of the team but has moved on elsewhere. And we've also conducted workshops and large-scale surveys across lots of different countries. So there's lots of data that we've collected across various countries, and various findings that have come out of that.
Yeah, what do you think has been the biggest challenge you've faced in doing any of that work? It's been a long journey for sure.
It's definitely been a long journey. Yeah, the biggest challenge. I think it's, first of all, for me, trying to grasp an understanding of what enhanced rock weathering is myself, because as we've seen in our results, and you've already alluded to, generally people haven't heard of enhanced rock weathering or even carbon removal. It's not something they really think about day to day in their lives. So for me, first trying to develop my own understanding, and then thinking about these methodologies and how to adapt them to fit different groups of people or different environments, different cultures. I think that's been a real challenge, and having the right people there to help, and tapping into expertise as well, and the need to make sure you know who can help and who can feed into what you're developing. So I think that's been quite a challenge over the full period, and needing to have flexibility to get around lots of deadlines or the need for government permits, these kinds of things. So they've all kind of fed into it.
I was going to say though, one of my, I mean, maybe you disagree with this, but one of the advantages of working under a 10-year funded centre and with very good collaboration from our natural science colleagues, because we meet on a regular basis, is they've actually taught us a lot about the technology, and that actually is part of doing interdisciplinary research. You have to, in my mind, you have to listen quite carefully. And I know I spent at least 2 years listening quite carefully, and you sort of said the same thing, haven't you?
Yeah, I think so. I think
Yes.
so. I mean, I think
Yes.
the very first Leverhulme meeting I went to, I spent a lot of it just like, I don't know what anyone's talking about.
Yes,
But I
yes.
think as the years have gone on, you start to pick it up. You start to see changes and findings that people have.
Yeah.
And then I think really questioning what people are presenting, or trying to get an understanding of what exactly does that mean. If I was speaking to someone on the street or somewhere in public, how would you interpret that and speak to them about it? So I think it's been really useful to have that expertise and have those informal conversations and have these meetings so regularly to do that.
Yeah, and without that, we wouldn't have been able to design the surveys and the workshops that we've used to collect our primary data. So first question then, people out there I'm sure would like to know, from your survey work, what do people know about enhanced weathering? What's the level of awareness broadly?
Yeah, sure. So the survey, like I said, we had an initial small survey which was published in 2017 that you sort of led on the writing of that. And that showed people had really low levels of awareness. And that was just a small UK sample. But then when we started the Leverhulme project, we looked at 3 of the countries, so the 3 field research sites in the UK, US and Australia. We wanted to understand across these 3 groups, okay, at baseline, how do people think about enhanced rock weathering, if they do, and what potentially could feed into their wider perceptions as well. So we found that generally people are saying, I've never heard of enhanced rock weathering before. That was definitely the largest proportion of participants. And even now, like today, there's more research that's looking at these kinds of things, and it's still a very low level of awareness.
Yes, we've been having a debate about that amongst the research team. We've been going 10 years, and there's a sense in which you don't detect public views have changed a lot, but it is clear that more policymakers and more people who know about carbon removal, which has become an important part of the challenge to fight climate change, do know about this technology. I think it'd be fair to say there. But people on the street, out there in the pub, probably still know relatively little if you told them what you did.
Yeah.
They'd say, what is that? Okay. So again, as an environmental psychologist, obviously you would know about some of the issues that are likely to drive perceptions. So again, what does your work say about which of those are most important in understanding how people immediately respond in a survey or when being told about enhanced weathering?
Yeah, so I think in the survey, obviously, because we kind of had a sense that, okay, people aren't really going to know what enhanced rock weathering is. So we along with our colleagues in various parts of the world, came up with clear definitions of what enhanced rock weathering was, what it might visually look like. And then people sort of fed into, what their first thoughts were about it and answered questions about various risks and benefits. And it really became clear that people felt quite negative about it. They felt that so it's an effective response that people were having towards it. Like, it seemed quite negative, I think, because of the processes involved in it. Seeing that you might potentially need to mine some material to spread onto cropland, and mining's already got this really strong negative connotation for people. They need to transport that material, and that's potentially going to use energy and cause emissions, which is the opposite of what you want to be doing. But I think the strongest response probably relates to, and you mentioned this earlier, the impacts on wildlife biodiversity, and especially the oceans as well, so marine organisms. So I think the idea that you might impact on systems or places that, it's not, they're seen as pristine environments perhaps. They're sort of untouched by human hands, which isn't necessarily, of course, true. I mean, there's lots of things going on in the oceans that humans are responsible for, or other natural disasters ongoing. But the perception is it's pristine. It's not.
Yeah, but of course, sociologists would say if somebody believes something is true, then for them it is true.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I mean, that's a good example of that, actually. That, which is why, again, it's important to find out what some of those beliefs are. I mean, thinking about this, what's the advantage of doing... So that's sort of from the survey work. And what would be the advantage of doing the deliberative work? And can you say a little bit about the design of those, or what a day... We have participants who come in to learn about enhanced weathering. What does a workshop look like, the sorts of workshops you've conducted?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, we've done lots of different workshops. So I guess I can talk about the ones that we conducted in the US and UK, which were, they had a similar format. We thought, they're both westernized countries. They're both similar field trials. So the day, basically, I think for those particular ones, we decided that we wanted to have 2 evening workshops. So people could finish work and then come along and then come back a week later to really talk more about enhanced weathering. So obviously, as we learned from the survey, we knew that low levels of awareness were going to be present. But we also didn't want to focus just on enhanced weathering. We wanted to think about other types of carbon removal, because otherwise it's hard to really know, is this negative perception that people potentially might have due to thoughts about CDR more generally, or is it specific to enhanced weathering? So we also introduced other potential carbon removal strategies that might be appropriate for the US or for the UK. I don't know how technical we want to get with what they are, but we had direct air capture, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage that we also presented in these 2 as well. So we tend to start out by thinking about the wider issue. Why are we doing this? So you're starting out talking about climate change and why that might matter to people before you're delving into these really complex technologies, and to try and situate, okay, how do people think about climate change? Does it matter to them? What issues might come out? And thinking about place as well, where they're located, potential issues that might be around. So I think that's kind of where we tend to start. And then it's introducing solutions to climate change. So the UK and the US ones, we were thinking about energy transitions and thinking about mitigating climate change, adaptation strategies, and then also starting to then think about other strategies, so thinking about carbon removal.
Because carbon removal is rather different from those other 2, which are more conventional ways of thinking about
Exactly. And that's what people really are generally thinking about when thinking about tackling climate change. They're not thinking about these further on solutions. They're still thinking, okay, we need to reduce emissions. These are the different methods that we're aware of already.
And that technique, which actually other people have picked up on and using in other research of letting people go away for a week or a few days to talk to and we would say talk to their friends and look on the web and whatever. That's quite an innovation, isn't it? And so that's done to really allow people to have a good think about what we presented in the first session, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's so much new information that people are learning, particularly because you're introducing these 3 different types of technologies, which are like, okay, we've never heard of any of these before necessarily. So giving them the chance to go home and speak to their family. We also said that they could look on the internet and use Google or use Wikipedia. And some people came back with pages of notes from some of their family and friends who'd gone and looked up things. And then we had some other responses who were like, I'm not particularly interested in that, depending where you were. But really useful, I think, because it gave people that time to really think about, okay, what does this look like? And, what do other people think about this too?
One of the findings from that work, as I remember, was that, you said that this initial surface response is slightly negative because of some of the connotations that are there. But I think we did find, didn't we, that people became a little more positive as the workshop went on. And I should add, actually, with some other technologies, that isn't always the case. Sometimes people can become more negative. So that in a way, that's an interesting finding, isn't it? That once people started digging into why you were doing enhanced weathering and some of its features, the concerns didn't necessarily go away, but the overall balance of opinion did change to some extent.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think as well, because when you're presenting alongside other potential strategies, it's like, but I can see with this one, for example, you'd need to use lots of land, for example. Whereas this one, okay, you can already do this on existing farmland, for example. You're not having to find new areas to build a carbon capture plant or grow your bioenergy crops, depending on what it is. So I think having that time to really process and think, okay, what does this actually look like? Now I've thought about it. And people did start to think, okay, it's not maybe as bad as I initially thought. And I think you mentioned earlier, there's so many other types of solutions that are now coming more to the fore again, that, as we're going further down the line.
Now, just the workshops, what would you say were the two, for you, what were the 2 interesting findings that came out of the workshops, or one interesting finding?
Yeah, okay. So I think what we've just talked about was quite interesting, the change in perception over time. So the fact that people did become more positive about it after they've seen the initial process that you may have to mine and it affects the oceans. But as well, within these workshops, we had specialist groups as well. So we had a group that was really trying to speak to farmers or the farming community. And they've got slightly different interests in more general publics. So they're thinking about it from a more practical element. So for them, it's really thinking about the economics and how that could potentially be important to them and what the real impacts would be on their crops. So,
as I recall, they were very concerned about the bottom line, weren't they? And
yes.
They needed to be convinced that this was going to help their farming business.
Yeah, exactly. But there's still that interest of potentially trying it if the science was there. So, really thinking about the uncertainties was still there.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's really interesting. And you've also done some work in the Global South as well, because we had the field trials, or the Leverhulme Centre has the field trial sites in Malaysia. I don't think we can go through in huge detail the responses there, because I think it's quite both of them are quite complicated data sets. But again, what was the challenge in doing work in the Global South? And I know it took longer, didn't it, than to design and set up than the Global North work.
Yeah, the challenge, the language for starters, a completely different language, and how to, I remember one of the members of the team, Melissa Payne and Robin Lim, they're thinking, what actually is the Malay for enhanced weathering? Is there a term that we can use?
No.
We did find one. They did come up with one. They did say there is one, so we can use it. And translating all the material, because some of it was quite technical, to explain this is what enhanced weathering is. And the other technologies. So I think having access to locals on the ground really helped, and having that time and flexibility and that expertise to help us design these workshops was invaluable. And
Robin and Melissa were part of the Southeast Asian Rainforest Research Partnership, who are running the field, or have been involved in running the actual field trials. So they were sort of expert in the local deployment. And that's something I would say that for anybody who's thinking about doing Global South research from the Global North, you really do need good partners in the global south who would help you design and adapt your methods and your approaches to the local culture and communities. Yeah. Again, any one difference you found in the work with the Malaysia groups?
Yeah, I think when we conducted them in Malaysia, place came out a lot stronger, I think. I think because, so we were in Sabah and Borneo. Place was really important to people. For example, as soon as we started talking about mining, they're like, we've had a lot of mining companies and issues with this in the past. So there was this concern that potentially could have an impact. I think as well, the economic factor, again, that was really important. So because it's still a developing country, it's an emerging economy, how this could potentially benefit smallholders, that was really important for people. So even within the urban groups, they were thinking about how will this impact people in the urban environment and these rural communities. So that was really important, I think, across the board.
And what do you think? I mean, and maybe we can wrap up with this one. And this is not really an easy question. What would, if you were advising a science communicator about enhanced weathering, what would be your advice to them based upon all the knowledge you've got, how they might go about presenting it in a podcast like this?
Yeah, that's actually quite a hard question, I think, because we talk quite a lot about avoiding certain framings. So, for example, you wouldn't necessarily frame it as this is a natural amendment you're doing, or a amendment to soils, or and like that. So frames, I think, are something we tend to say avoid doing for science communication purposes. But I think it depends on what the purpose of your communication is.
Yeah. Are
you engaging with a policymaker, or are you engaging with a group of farmers, perhaps? So I think it's really dependent on who you're communicating to.
Because there has been a debate about framing, particularly in relation to wider questions of geoengineering, that if you would start off with a very strong frame, like it's a climate emergency, that kind of closes off options, because it doesn't really give anybody a choice about whether you need a radical solution, whereas other people might want to explore less radical solutions like conventional mitigation in response to hearing about this technology. So I suppose that you want to avoid those that are really close the debate down. But equally, I mean, I think certainly from my perspective, it's not that you're avoiding frames. You're trying, if there are strong frames, just be aware of them, and you're trying to balance them out and trying to say, well, there are different opinions here in this. Because I know depending on how you talk about it, you could think of enhanced weathering as a carbon removal technology or as a soil amendment technology. You could think about it in industrial terms, from mining through to spreading, or in terms of agricultural practice. And there are rather different ways of thinking about what the technology is in deployment.
Yeah, I think it depends on the audience for sure.
And it depends upon the audience. That's risk communication 102, I think, as we would say, that always know who your audience are, because there are different audiences. So I think, thank you very much, Elspeth. That's been absolutely brilliant conversation, and thanks for sharing some of your expertise and thoughts with us.
Yep, thank you very much. And yeah, good questions.